First of all, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in and agreeing to sort of be part of this conversations at the Royal. My name is Ian Mendes, co-host of The Drive on TSN 1200, here with Lee Versage, the two of us. I'm sure you were all listening, right?
Today.
Show of hands, anybody who listened?
Well, that's a couple.
That's
right?
more than we thought we were going to put up their hands. So that that makes us feel good. And Lee's going to talk about this in a second, but this has become a really important initiative for us at our radio station, and in particular in our time slot, to try and do something bigger than just talking about sports, just talking about power plays that aren't working and teams that aren't winning games. Use your platform for something a little bit greater. And we've decided to kind of partner up with the Royal and have conversations about men's health. So we each want to just give a little bit of an anecdote kind of about why we're here and why this means a lot to us. I know I want to kind of give the floor to Lee here first.
Well, thanks. And as Ian said, we're very, very honored to have the platform to be able to do it. And I think when in the month of November, we've had different guests in, Dr. Bada has been in, and we'll hear from him a little bit later, but we've talked about suicides in men. We've talked about PTSD, and lots of different things, anger in men. And it's startling, some of the statistics that really hit you when in middle-aged men, 80% of all the suicides in this country are men, and most of them middle-aged men. 80%. I mean, I can't even compute that right now. It's such a difficult thing. So 1 in 10 men experience depression at some point in their lives. And I think we've all had different battles and wondering at some point in our life, what's going on. I know I have, and I know some people that are here have, and so we're going to talk about that as it goes along as well. And I think when you have the opportunity to be able to do that and talk about it, we're here to talk about mental wellness in the workplace. And for men specifically, it's just something we don't talk about. We're supposed to be the ones that come home and kind of look after everybody else, and you certainly don't go to work and be able to express yourself and talk about your feelings all the time, because first of all, you're at work, and then second of all, you have no idea if anybody wants to hear it. And it's just so important to just begin the conversation. So we've tried to do that every Wednesday on The Drive, and it's something I know that we're going to try and continue to do, but it's events like this that going to bring us a little bit closer together and understand, to be able to talk about these things, because you realize how communication is just the first step, but it's such a large step in what we're doing. So we're here to do that tonight, and hopefully we all walk out maybe a little bit more intelligent as far as what we've learned and what we've been able to talk about tonight. So I think we're here to do it, and we're excited to do it because I think it's so important how it's affected many of us in this room. So I know, Ian, we're going to start with some of the guests, and we're going to have a great conversation later with Alex Mateas, who's here from the Ottawa REDBLACKS as well. And I mean, in the football environment, in the sports environment, we deal with it every day, and Alex does too. And so that's a different aspect of this. So we'll try and attack it from a lot of different angles. Yeah,
and before I bring Dr. Batla up, just from my own perspective, I want to tell two kind of stories, two quick little anecdotes if I can. The first one would be, I've experienced that kind of that battle, that struggle between your work-life balance. And I'll tell you, 6 years ago, I had probably one of the best, I still feel like I have one of the best jobs in the city, but I think I had one of the best jobs going. I used to be on television. I used to host Ottawa Senators games on Sportsnet. I got to travel all over the world, literally Europe, all over North America. I'm doing World Series, Olympic Games, Stanley Cup, all these things. And I'll tell you what, it's a grind. And I don't think, I'm so glad that using the rear view mirror, that I was able to look back and realize, you know what, I'm running out of gas. I can't do this. I can't do the work-life balance. I felt like a total fraud because I used to write a column for Today's Parent when our kids were really little, and I loved doing it. But every time I would hit the send button, I'd be like, here I'm writing about parenting and being a dad, and I'm gone about 150 days a year. And it got to the point for me where I thought, I need to get off the crazy train here. I need to get off of this wild roller coaster that is taking me away from my family. And it's hard because I think a lot of times for men, you think my job is my priority, that's what I need to do, and status is everything. And I'm so glad I did it. And I'm so glad I stepped away and I said I made this decision to put my family first, because my feeling was always this. At some point down the road, maybe I could do TV again, but I'll never go back to that moment when my kids are small. Never again. I get a one shot in your lifetime to do something like this. And so I try really hard to encourage men that a job is not, a job is what you do, it's not who you are. And I think sometimes as guys, we confuse the two things. It's not, a job is just what you do, it's not who you are. And, for me, I'm really glad I came to that recognition that I needed to get away, step away from a situation that I think was probably taxing me in ways that I didn't realize. The other thing I want to pass along, and I don't think I've ever really talked about this on the air, is that my roommate in college, university, at Carleton, had a roommate named Travis, and he took his own life 2011. In May of 2011, I got a text from one of my other really good friends in university saying, Travis has taken his own life. And I always look back, and I know my group of friends, we always look back and think, what did we do wrong? Like, did we not open up a conversation? Did we not create an environment that facilitated that type of connection that could have been made? Did we drop the ball? And I do. I often go back and think about that. And I know my group of friends goes back and thinks about that because we were very tight in university. And as guys, we don't do that. Guys don't get together and talk about their feelings. Guys don't get together and talk about what's bugging them. And that's what's really encouraging tonight, is to look up into this crowd and see the majority of people here are guys. And it's great. And obviously there's some women here too, but I think it's fantastic to see so many guys here inside the auditorium.
And just to kind of follow up on what Ian said, so Ian, that was his story, and he talked about for men in the workplace, they're trying to strive and the job is everything and you need to get to a certain status. Well, that was me, and I was just trying to get there, and I don't have kids like Ian does, and I was trying to elevate and trying to do everything I could for the job, and the job just sort of took over my life a little bit. And we'll talk a little bit more about it, I think, when Alex comes up, but Ian talked about a couple of moments, and for me, I had a moment, and it was, one of them was with Ian, and we were on a ride to Buffalo, and we were coming back from the NHL draft, and you think, oh, what an unbelievable time. You go cover the draft, and you're doing everything for the Senators and the NHL for the station, and I was a mess. I was not in where I should be whatsoever, and end up talking to Ian all the way home from Buffalo. He didn't get a word in edgewise, which I try and give him some words sometimes on the drive, but he didn't get a word in edgewise that day. And it was his ability to recognize that, hey, you know what? I don't think he's right. So I'm going to open up a conversation with him. And then it was what I needed to sort of get going in a better direction. And I go back to, and we have moments that you go back to that things change. And that day changed for me, and I ended up trying to seek out some professional help that I didn't think at the time that I needed. And so that kind of led us as a better, I was already really good friends with Ian, but he might disagree, but we were, and he says on the air all the time this frolics thing, friends and colleagues, it's a combination. And are we friends or are we frolics?
You're a cherished frolic.
Right, I appreciate that.
Half friend, half colleague.
Yeah, but I'm cherished, and you know what? I'll take that.
There you go.
But it was that day where he really reached out and was he didn't care about what we were doing on the air, and he didn't care about the job. He just cared about me, and that was so important. And that was the point that things started to change in a different direction for me. So it was one of those things that we all have those moments. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but I think it's important to recognize those initial times in people's lives where you're like, okay, I'm looking at somebody else saying they're not right. I'm not just going to let it pass. I'm not just going to let it go by. I'm going to do something about it. I'm very thankful to Ian to be able to do that. And I think it's important to be able to look at people, no matter whether you're in the workplace, you have people you like, people you don't like, and probably some people in the middle at every workplace. But there's always a couple of people that you're a little bit closer to. And to be able to just spend some time and have a little bit of empathy and try and see what might they be going through. Are they right? Because I know them. I see them every day. And to just open up that conversation. And that's part of the reason I think why we're here tonight.
All right. Well, thank you for those kind words, Lee. We're going to invite Dr. Raj Batla up here. Dr. Batla is the psychiatrist in chief of the staff here at the Royal. Is a part of the editorial committee of the Journal of Ethics in Mental Health. This is quite the resume here, so settle in. He doesn't. You don't.
We're good.
You're good.
Read a couple more. Read a couple more.
Okay. He went to Harvard. Yada yada. Okay. You know what? I'm going to embarrass you, aren't I? But Dr. Raj Batla, who's been nice enough to join us a number of times on the radio. Thanks.
So this is going to be, I would call it a speed presentation, because I have 6.5 minutes to present a lot of material. It's just about data. Those of you who have heard me talk before know that I present slides and information, so it's almost awareness raising. So I'll try to do some of that, and I'm going to go really quickly. We're going to talk about boys, we're going to talk about young men, we're going to talk about getting a little bit older men, we're going to touch on suicide and a few other things, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Wang, who's going to talk about depression in a workplace, but I'm really looking forward to a panel discussion and Alex talking to us about his bit of his story, and he's really good at doing it. He just doesn't know it yet, so you'll find out. So let's get going. Okay, here's some interesting data. This is The Economist 2015. Some of you may have seen this type of data before, but when you look at it, we always hear about, or a lot in the media, about girls, women, and access to education, post-secondary schooling. Well, tell you what, we are well past the 50% mark. Globally, women have more access to secondary school and to university education than men. And it's been that way for quite some time. And in a knowledge-based economy, what is going to happen in the future? So that's the trend, and you don't hear that very much, usually. Here's a fascinating sort of quote from a large study in the UK. We have similar data from the US, where we actually look at these things, and it's a pretty profound statement. And I showed this to last week a principal's breakfast, and people were pretty surprised. So this is a self-esteem issue for boys starting around the age of 4, and by the age of 7, they really feel, from a self-esteem point of view, they are outclassed by girls. And if you think about it, that's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when you don't feel you measure up at the age of 4, 5, 6, 7, you are not going to necessarily have a great trajectory going forward. And I don't think many people know this type of data. We don't look at it in Canada. UK does, Australia does, New Zealand does, actually, and the US does. We don't look at much of this in Canada. Okay, I thought I'd look, and I haven't presented this before here, but here's the Ontario Ministry of Education suspension data. So what do we do real early on? We start to suspend our boys pretty quickly compared to girls. So they're being suspended. That's not a good thing. Well, maybe they're not being expelled very much from school. Let's see. Well, there's our data. Who are we expelling from school? That can't be a good thing. People can read that graph, right? It's it's pretty big. So it's hard to see the red. It's overshadowed by the blue. But we expel a lot of boys. And that's just not a recipe for success later on in life. I won't explain that. Here's interesting data, and I won't tie it directly together, but let's see other data. Again, I think this is Canadian data. But your role model early on are your parents, usually. One of your parents, someone else possibly, but that's classically your role model. Your first societal authority figure is your elementary school teacher, almost always. And here's elementary school teacher data from, this one is Ontario. So one of my kids actually said it the best. At kindergarten, comes home talking about day in school, good thing. He was talking to Dave, the man teacher. So, out of the mouths of babes, he kind of explained the data in one sentence. Some incarceration data for your consideration. This is adults. If you could read the graph, 18 to 19, it's stratified by age, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. We put a lot of men in jail in Canada. We do it well and we do it often. So there's Canadian data. But it starts actually before the age of 18. Let's look at the data prior to 18. Boys. We actually do it to boys. We incarcerate our boys. Again, not a recipe for success in life. Now, a little bit of, you can look this one up. I don't have time to get into it. There's a fascinating article in the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry, September 2018. It's an editorial by Dr. Whitley, who talks about men's mental health and the whole concept of victim blaming. And I'll try to summarize a little bit. When we talk about men's health and men's mental health, we often talk about how men should do things. So, what should men do? Men should learn how to express their feelings. By the way, that's kind of true, but listen to the should statements. Men should learn how to communicate. Men should attend their appointments more. Men should attend groups and do group therapy. We have a lot of men shoulds, and anytime you use a should statement, you're in trouble because you are blaming the individual that may need help. The example that's given in this paper is we would never say, because we're much more sophisticated in other areas, would we ever say individuals with bulimia, mainly girls, but men as well, by the way, boys and girls, have bulimia, or anorexia, more importantly, anorexia nervosa. So that's when you're not eating, you're starving yourself. Horrible illness. No one says, people with anorexia should eat more. We just don't do that. We look at the multifactorial elements that relate to not eating and the disease of anorexia. So any should statement's a problem. So when you hear about what men should do, there's a subtle but clear blame. I'll leave that there. Get back to data. Here's the young men data, and you've heard of the opioid crisis, right? People are dying from the opioid crisis. Does anyone know the data? Here's the data on young men, because it's mainly young men, that late teens, 20s, into the 40s, that's the group who's dying most by opioid overdose. And 20 to 30% are felt to be suicide. And in Ontario, what's our data? It hasn't changed much. This is 2018, 74% young men. And it's higher in other provinces. In fact, this stat's fascinating. It's going so rapidly, for the first time in decades, the life expectancy in Canada, it will actually go down. And this is why. It's a shocking number. Let's go to middle-aged men. And Lee's already told us a bit about that. There's your graph about death by suicide. The biggest demographic is middle-aged men. And usually in the prime of their work life. And that's also very much later in the 90s as well. But from a numbers point of view, there aren't that many men in the 90s. But middle-aged men really are the ones that are by far in numbers dying by suicide. And again, not well understood, and we rarely talk about it. This, by the way, the ratio stays the same in most groups, even the very high-risk groups, and there are some groups we really need to focus on. Indigenous population, the Inuit, hugely high rates of suicide. The ratio stays the same, men to women, in almost all groups. And there's your life expectancy in general, men and women. So women in general live about 5 years longer than men. And interestingly, a couple of years ago, the media caught just a little bit of a statement of, simply being born male is a risk factor for poor mental health and premature death. So, and it's true. When you're born and you're a guy, your chances of death before someone else that might be female is earlier. So in occupation, and this is particularly true in the areas of forestry, construction, huge issue, mining, that's the number. So it's over 90% of fatalities are men. And here we're back to more closer to home, education. To me, this is the most concerning thing. In a knowledge-based economy, look at the trend line and what is going to happen to men. So this actually has to do with college degrees in the US. It's not that different in Canada. And actually it was about even in the 80s, early 80s. So we're thinking in the 80s when you talk about access to education, men are being outclassed and attending university much less than women. STEM, what about STEM? Huge problem for women in STEM, right? We all know that. We must encourage our young girls to get into the STEM fields. STEM, oh, geez. Mathematics, engineering, science, what's the other one, guys? Technology. Thank you. What's the data? There's your data. That's the current data. So you never hear that. But partially, by the way, it is, for those of you who might be wondering why other data is different, if you carve out the health sciences and medicine, then men are overrepresented. But normally when you hear that, the data is skewed nicely and they don't include the other sciences. But that is the true data. And I'm actually going to just reinforce something that Lee mentioned, actually. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Wang, but really, men's identity are much more closely related to their occupation in general than women. And of course, there's crossover in all of my statements, but in general, men's identities are very, very closely aligned to their work life. And Ian put it really well. The courage to change what you did to rebalance things is remarkable, and you should be really applauded for that, and not many people do it. So that's a good recognition early on in your life. So I'm going to leave it there. Here are a couple of types of resourcing and information. Yeah, I've done a 2015 lecture in male mental health. It's part of these conversations, and it gives you a really broad overview about male mental health. And I will have you come up, Dr. Wang, an expert.
Well, hello everyone. Good evening. My name is Jian Wang. I'm a health scientist here at the Royal, and also I'm a public health researcher. So now I'm gonna specifically talk about depression in the workplace, because we know depression is one of the most prevalent mental illness in the workplace, and has a huge impact on employee health and productivity. But in the community, when we when it comes to depression, and many of us think, well, depression is for somebody else. It's not for me because I'm a tough guy, right? Or it's belongs to some disadvantaged groups, not me. But those actually are some misunderstanding. So because I'm gonna show you this picture, can you recognize those faces? There's Winston Churchill, Diana, Kate Spade, and Anthony Bourdain, right? So these are the high-profile public figures from different countries and then different fields. But they had something in common. They all had the experience of major depression or major depressive disorder. And we know the Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain actually died because of that. So the message here is no matter who you are, no matter your sex, where you are, and your socio-economic status, no one is immune to depression. Okay? So what causes depression? What are the triggers for depression? There are many, but some are related to our work. I'm not saying work is bad for your health. Work is actually good for your health because it gives you the social identity, gives you the income. Only if you are exposed to a negative work environment for a long time, then that can precipitate your risk of having depression. So here I show you there are three broad type of the risk factors in the workplace. First one is job stress. I think now you are all familiar with that. But when we're talking about work stress, you may say, well, yes, I have a lot of work to do. I have a lot of demand. I have a time pressure, multiple deadlines, etc. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have a high job stress. Okay? If you have the control over your work pace, if you have a say about how the work can be done, and you may not have job stress, even though you have a high job demand or multiple like a deadline. Okay, so only if your job demand exceeds your control, then you have job stress. Okay, the second one is called the effort and the reward imbalance, which means we as employees invest our efforts, our time into our work, and we also want appropriate rewards. Okay? So the rewards could be taken in a different forms, depending on the driver for performance. Some may be the financial incentives, like the increase your salary. Some may be just the recognition or the opportunity to grow. So it depends. But if your efforts are not appropriately rewarded in long time, people will become depressed. They're frustrated. And then number three is what we call work-family conflicts. And Ian just mentioned it, at his, in his talk. And this is actually a two-direction concept, which means the work can interfere with your family roles. And on the other hand, is your family responsibility can interfere with your work. Okay, and these are three broad type of risk factors, and for both men and women. But our research shows the job stress and family to work interference or conflicts had more impact on men's mental health. Okay. Also, there are some risk factors in the workplace depend on the context. So we did a project which is funded by the Movember Foundation, in which we talked to the men in the workplace across the country. So we found the risk factors, or we're trying to understand what make them feel stressed. And on the top of the list is job security. Okay, but it all depends on where you work. If you work in the private sector, job security is on the very top of it. But if you work in the government, that's not a concern. Okay, so job security insecurity is always a top concern for men, because we started our project in the 2015, and that's the time that when the economic crisis just started. And many people in the western part of Canada just lost their job. So the common scenario we can see is a middle-aged man, and with a family, maybe 2 or 3 kids, and one maybe in the university, one in the high school, and his salary is the sole family income. And you can see many of your colleagues being laid off, and you're thinking, when is me, right? You don't know when you will be laid off. So there's a lot of anxiety in the western part of Canada. So you can think of that job insecurity can really make you feel depressed and nervous. Right? And the second one is a lack of workplace support and a lack of respect. And this is commonly exist in some sectors which are male-dominated sector. Okay? But the sources of stress always come from, not just from a workplace, it's always a combination of work stressor and the personal stressor. And you think of you have the high job demand, you have so much work to do, and you have a lack of support at the workplace. But on the other hand, you have your own health issue, you have your own financial issue, and also the caregiver issues. I think many of us in the, like say, age 50 or 40, you have to not only take care of your children, but also your parents, right? So there's a lot of things going on in combination of personal and workplace issues, okay? So how to deal with that? One of the strategy is, I think it's just to enhance your resilience and the self-care skills. So as a part of the Movember project, we talked to over 250 men across the country to understand the issues that they are experiencing in their family, in their workplace. And from this 250 interview, we summarized 12 unique case scenarios. What we mean unique is unique in terms of demographics and the stressors they encountered. So some are for young men and some for older men, and we also have case scenarios for immigrants and also for first responder, etc. And we summarized the stress or the issues they encountered in the workplace. And then we organized the 4 international expert panel. So one panel is academia, one panel is HR people or business owner, one panel is occupational health professional, physician and OT, and then one panel is just men in the workplace. So we presented all these case scenarios, say, here is what Steve just experienced, and that's his problem. What Steve can do, from your experience and from the research evidence. So we did this international device study to reach consensus about what this specific person can do. We also summarized what Steve said about what strategies he used that worked for him. So we're aiming to compile all these work stressor and also the evidence-based solutions into one education package and provide it to men in the future, so you can take a reference and learn what the experts say and also what Steve does, so you can learn from there and to improve your own self-care skill. The other strategy is, I think, is being more proactive. Depression is not only treatable, it's also preventable. Okay? So instead of thinking of my family doctor gonna help me when I become depressed, you should be more proactive, by thinking, what should I do now to have a better life so I don't have depression at first place, right? So many of us to engage in physical activity and eat healthy diet to have a better life, and so we don't have a heart disease, we don't have cancer. So for mental health, we really also need to embrace this notion of early prevention and do the same in the mental health area. So to take such preventive action, we usually need some. One of the major drivers is our perceived risk. So if your doctor tells you, John, you're at high risk of have a heart disease or diabetes, you really need to do 1, 2, 3. Okay. So in this case, if you know you are at a high risk, you're probably more likely to engage in physical activity and eat healthy diet, or reduce or even quit smoking. Right. But how do you know about your own mental health status? Okay. How we will know about your personal risk of having depression in the future? Okay, where are you going to find this information? Okay, so we have developed a tools called risk calculator, which is funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research. We analyzed the data from over 10,000 Canadians across the country, and these data were collected by Statistics Canada. And we developed one risk calculator for men and one risk calculator for women. And these risk calculators include the question about your sex, your age, your family history, your socioeconomic status, and your ongoing stressors, and also your childhood trauma experience. But the questions for men and women are slightly different. So these tools are to be used by people in the community who do not have a clinical depression at the moment in time when you use it. And then by answering these questions, and the tools can automatically calculate your personalized risk or probability of having clinical depression in the future, in the next 4 years. Okay? We converted this tool into a web-based program, and you can try after this meeting, after this talk, and it's at the domain called predictingdepression.com. Okay, this is the front page, and by enter this page, and they're gonna ask you to identify yourself in terms of your sex and age, because the question for men and women are different. So after you finish this answering the questions, and this program will tell you your personalized risk of having depression. So the whole process may take about 3 minutes. So it's very short and quick. This is on the website, but we have not implemented in a large scale, because as the health researchers, we are thinking before we implement it, we need to answer some important questions. For example, whether or not people want to know this information. And if so, if we provide this information to you, will this cause any harms to you? Like say, will that make you feel more nervous or more depressed? So we want to understand these potential psychological harms or potential benefits from there. So we did a randomized control trial, which is also funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research. So we recruited 350 men and 350 women who are at high risk across the country. And one group, we did not give them anything, and the other group, we asked them, say, based on your answer to our question, we can calculate your personalized risk of having depression. Do you want to know it? And if they say, I want to know it, and then we tell them. So the result shows, overwhelmingly, in the intervention group, over 93% of people say, I want to know it. Okay? So then we follow them from the baseline to 6 months to 12 months. And our data shows there's no psychological harm at all. Okay? We compare the group, we follow them to see how they do in comparison to the other group. We found that there's no difference in terms of their stress, in terms of their psychological distress. So there's no psychological harm. So what do people react, when they receive this information? So we ask them, say, what do you think about this information? And the people said, everyone in the community should have access to this piece of information about their own risk. Okay? And this piece of information had actually motivated them to do something, especially in men. I was surprised. I thought women may be more likely to do something, after knowing their risk. But our data shows men are more likely to actually do something, like say, go out of the house and exercise and talking to their friends about their personal issues. Actually, men were more likely to do it. The other results, interesting results we had is people in the community tend to overestimate their risk of having depression by number. But mentally, they're more likely to underestimate the risk. What that means is We talk to a person, say, John, what do you think your chance of having depression in the next 4 years? From 0 to 100%. And this person say 50-50. And from his perspective, he thinks that's low risk. He will be low risk. And we told him, say, well, based on our risk calculation, your risk of having a clinical depression over the next 4 years is 30%. And he said, wow, I'm okay. I'm doing good. Okay? Then we told him, you know what? Do you know the average risk of having a major depression in men, in Canadian men? What is the average risk? Do you know that? It's 5%. So you are actually at a high risk because your risk is almost 6 times higher than the national average. So this person is at a high risk, but is tend to overestimate his risk by number, but mentally they think it's at a low risk. Okay. So which is why we developed this risk communication tool for this project, which shows this is a template for women actually, because that is my staff prepared for me. We don't have the a template for men. I should have a one for men. So, but the layout is basically the same. So the first section shows your personal risk, what that means, what is the national risk, so you can make the comparison. And the second section shows what are the risk factors contributed to your personal risk. And the bottom one is a graphic. It shows the national risk and your personal risk. And also on the far right hand, that bar is if you can eliminate all these risk factors, that's how much risk you can reduce. Okay. On the other side, it shows what are the strategies you are using to deal with stress. And below that are say, on top of what you're doing, here are some self-help strategy you may try based on the research, from the research community. And on the bottom is, these are the things you try to avoid, okay? And like, drinking alcohol and using drug to alleviate stress. So these are the risk communication tools we developed from this project. So to wrap up, I talked about depression is prevalent and disabling in the workplace. And there are many factors can precipitate depression, and some are the work-related factors. So like the negative work environment. And what we can do, I think we should pay more attention on early prevention. You need to enhance your self-care skills, your resiliency, and also being more proactive because prevention, pays more than cure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wong, and also to Dr. Batla. So we're going to invite Alex Mateas to come up here and join Lee Versage, and I'll let Lee do the intro for Alex, but they're going to have just kind of a conversation, and after they're done their conversation, they're going to invite any questions that you have to Alex to come to him.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Alex, for being here. We'll get the doctors back up here. We'll have a Q&A afterwards, but something Dr. Bada said while he was speaking kind of really struck me, is like, especially with men, in your workplace, it becomes your identity. And I think, for me, Alex, and I'm sure for you, it's like, okay, well, people listen to the radio and that's what Lee Versage is. And people watch football games and they go, oh, Alex Mateas, he's a football player. Well, no, he's a human being. So first of all, thanks, Alex, for being here. And I know that, every story is different, but I think it's pretty good to give a base here of your story of when you picked football up in the first place, because I think it gives people a pretty good indication of kind of where you were and playing catch up a little bit with how good of an athlete you were and some of the things that came along, the pressures and the stresses of playing football, because you picked it up at a bit of a late age.
Yes, I did. I started playing football when I was 16, but before I get into that, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Mental health has been single-handedly the most important piece to my success over the last 10, 15 years. And now that my career has kind of gone underway, I feel very open and blessed to be able to try and contribute to this very important issue.
There you go. We can hear you now.
Perfect.
It's good.
Could you hear me beforehand? I can yell too. I'm obviously more comfortable with that. So my journey, I started playing football probably around 14, 15 in high school.
Which is late, right? For some people to start playing.
Which is very late. I grew up playing sports my whole life. A lot of sports, soccer, judo, basketball, swimming. I have two of the best parents that anyone could ever ask for. But I started playing football pretty late compared to most other players at 16, 15, 16. And I had made the decision before I started playing that a scholarship and professional football was the one and only goal. Sports are fun, but at 14, 15, you start to think about your future. I had, fantastic coaches, and by the time I got to, so I played in Ottawa for 4 or 5 years. Eventually, I got a scholarship to Penn State University. After being there for 1 year, I ended up transferring to the University of Connecticut. And in my second year in Connecticut, third year in university, was when I had to make a decision, and I had to seek help for my mental health. It came about because my identity was linked to football and success in football. I'm very grateful for the support system I have in Ottawa, but you never want to let down anyone in your family or friends, especially the people that really believe in you. So I always linked my identity and my self-esteem to my success in football, and it caught up to me at the University of Connecticut. I was always struggling to succeed in football, being the Canadian kid that I am. You go down to the US and these boys are angry and hungry. And
big and good.
And big and good.
Yeah.
So for, a polite Canadian that didn't grow up in any violent sports, it was a big transition. And at the University of Connecticut, it was my year to shine. It was my year to step in as the starting center, to be the university player, the guy that has all the answers. And it was during that camp, after 3-4 days, so I'm not sure if anyone knows, but in football, before the season starts, for about 3-4 weeks, the whole team isolates themselves at one location, and you pretty much are involved in football from 7 in the morning till 10 at night. 2 practices, 3-4 meetings, everything's structured, and it's necessary in football. As difficult as it was to transition to, it's necessary in football to learn all the content. And after the 3rd day of my 3rd camp in university, I hadn't slept for more than a couple minutes for the first few nights. Practices were getting more and more difficult. I wasn't doing nearly as well as I wanted to, but what stressed me out even more was I wasn't doing as well as the team had expected from me. And it was during a team period when the offense was playing against the defense where I wasn't in the right mental and physical health, and one of the players actually pulled me down to the ground, which is normal in football, but I unfortunately landed on our star player's knee. And he was the guy that's on all the posters. He's the one that everyone knew around campus. And that just kind of broke me. Mental health has always been something that I've worked at, and sleep has always been something that's very important to me and something I've really had to try and be proactive with. But after 3 days injuring the star player on the team, thinking that I messed up his career as well as our team's career, I stayed after practice as everyone else kind of walked into the locker room, and I just kind of let it out. At that point, in that moment, the fact that it happened 20 minutes earlier, it's overwhelming. And so I'm sitting on the sideline, but luckily, everyone had kind of left, and so I was, crying and letting my emotion out, and it's my dream. It's everything I've worked towards. And luckily, the same way in your story, I had a very good friend, Casey Cochran, who stayed back with me. He noticed that, I was going through one of the most difficult times. I was really struggling, and he honestly just sat there beside me until I could catch my breath and try and express how I was feeling. And it was through that conversation that really started the process of seeking professional help. There's only so much that you can do as an individual, and it's dangerous when you get in your own head and you don't talk to someone else who has an outside perspective. So it was after that 3 days in the conversation with Casey that I went to the doctors, got some medications so that I could finish camp and at least sleep for those next 3-4 weeks. And then as soon as camp had finished, I started the mental health process, and that is by far the most helpful thing that I've done.
Yeah, I mean, amazing, right? For Alex to be able to do that. So we'll kind of finish with you with the story of your good friend kind of staying with you. But let's go back to the sleep part, because I don't know, for a lot of people that just think that sleep is something that, that's what I do, and I'm good on 6 hours or 7 hours, and I go on, and that's what I do because it's just normal. There are people that can sleep at any time, at any moment. In fact, I'm looking at one right now who I've traveled with a lot, and the guy can nap like in the brightest of lights with hundreds of people around, and I can't. So, but I got to a point too where when I started not to feel well, it started to create its own kind of buzz in my mind. And then I started sleeping less and less and less. And I think, Alex, you can speak to a little bit that how important that foundation is, because it took me a while, and it took me like some real help with some professionals to be able to make sure that I just started sleeping. And that was the first thing. That was the foundation of, okay, now I'm doing this, I can get on to look at some other things in my life. But before that, if you don't sleep, it's something that it's hard to fix a lot of the other problems. And you had that same encounter.
Most definitely. Life as it is difficult. You have social pressure, family, you have your own expectations, society's expectations of you. And if you're not sleeping, then you are not in the right form to handle any of that. So as soon as I started focusing on sleep, it was almost the first step towards regaining my mental health. As it's one task, and I couldn't do it by myself. Being an athlete, we always, if you want to get tired, then you just work your butt off and try and work out more, lift more weights, run more. But that wasn't working for me. It wasn't contributing to any more sound or quality sleep. And I had to seek some professional help for that. And it was incredible. And as soon as I started sleeping better, then I felt like I had the right tools to attack everything else.
And I think, you start to talk about football, and people must wonder what it's like. Okay, I'm not feeling the best about myself, but I'm in a football locker room, and guys are supposed to be tough, and I'm sure you don't really talk about that kind of stuff. Now, I guess I want to ask you, in the last 10 years or so, we've come so far when it comes to concussions and brain injury, and that we're so much more aware in all sports, but football number one. I mean, guys, especially you're on the line, you're battling, you're batting heads with a guy every single play. And it's good that we're talking about it, because it puts the brain in a spot where it's okay to talk about. We seem to now be okay to a point where we can talk about concussions and the way that the brain works because of physical injury. Well, if we can talk about it during physical injury, we can talk about it mentally as well, and how the brain works. Like, that conversation can come up a little bit more naturally. And I think concussions, I don't want to say it's weird, but in a way that it's kind of helped us be more normalized to talking about how the brain works, and not just physically. And with concussions in football, you guys talk about that all the time.
We do talk about it all the time, especially now as years go by. And at the professional level, at least, the players really have the opportunity to travel North America a little more and gain a little bit of perspective on lifestyle and how other people go about their business. And we do talk about concussions. It's fantastic to hear that the football community really is being proactive and educating us about how to protect ourselves. And through the discussion of concussions, we've brought up other aspects of our mental health. In football, it's a very macho alpha environment, But I find it pretty interesting as we've been preparing for this discussion. I think the older generation, if you talk to the older players, even 5-10 years, and as well as the coaches, there was no discussions about any of this. But now with the discussions of concussions, almost every single team at the university level or the professional level will bring in a sports psychologist to introduce us to the possibility of having to work at that. And in the football locker room, it's pretty interesting because every single player has been in a vulnerable situation. It might not be about our own mental health, and we might not discuss it a lot, but there's a little bit of empathy amongst one another because we understand that the other person might be struggling, or they might drop an interception. I might have a bad snap, or anything along those lines. And I think that opens the discussion about mental health and being vulnerable in that sense. It's still something that isn't widely talked about, but it's definitely growing, and I think it's in the right direction.
And I'm sure someone might ask you this in the Q&A, but to go into a football locker room and you're so concerned about winning, and as you said, it's very alpha. How difficult is it to be able to talk about how you're feeling, especially because your work environment is in the locker room with a whole bunch of other guys that professionally they care about winning because winning makes them more money, and that they love doing it, but that's the reality of the business and in a lot of sports. So is it difficult to go into a locker room and be able to discuss things like this? Is it becoming easier to be able to do?
It is still difficult to talk about, especially if you are in a room with a lot of people, or if you're trying to speak about it with a lot of people. It's a very sensitive subject, and each person's mental health and health is very individualized, and it would be much easier, as it was for myself, to speak to a good friend. I think this subject will always be a little bit more difficult to talk about, each individual's experience, but to bring up the broad subject of mental health and how men, might have this,
it's difficult to breach with somebody, and I think that's most of this discussion. It's about and maybe you can expand just a little bit further on the conversation. So you get thrown on your star player's leg. He's hurt for a while. You don't know for how long. You're not performing up to what you think is expectation, and everything starts to unravel. Everyone's worried about the star quarterback. Your friend's worried about you. And that one time where somebody said, you know what, I'm looking at him and I know that what he might be feeling, but I'm going to talk to him about it. I'm going to ask him about it. And your friend did, and that was the one conversation. And when you and I talked before, it usually starts with that, where do you find that one spot where you can say, okay, I trust this person, they sort of know what I'm going through, they are able to relate to me a little bit, and they're opening up themselves to be able to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened with you, right?
Definitely. It was a comfortable person that I trusted, and he was also, we had a relationship where he had been vulnerable, not to the same extent, but it's incredibly helpful to be able to have someone comfortable that you can speak to, or at least make the introduction about the subject. And the point that I remember from that conversation was we were discussing how I pretty much had mentioned that if I didn't succeed in football, that I don't know where my life was going to go, to be completely honest. And to verbalize that and to hear myself say it is incredibly impactful. And it also made me realize that my friend Casey Cochran doesn't have any skills to deal with someone who has suicidal thoughts. And immediately I realized, and the way that we had talked about in football, if I'm not successfully making a block as an offensive lineman, I'm going to go talk to my offensive line coach. Same thing in basketball. If I want to shoot a shot better, I'm going to go talk to my coach. If I want to lift weights better, I'm going to go to the weight room. But I need to get my mind right, and I need to be able to learn how to, learn how to perceive the situations that were presenting themselves in front of me, And that was the conversation that I had with Casey, and that was the spark that made me realize that I had to talk to someone who knew what they were doing, and to look at it objectively. And it's a space where you can be completely vulnerable. You have to be fully honest with yourself in order to actually get better, and that's tough to do if your friends or your family might know more about you than you might want them to. And so that was really big for me. It was nice to be vulnerable in front of my friend, but when it's someone that you don't know who is there strictly to help you, that was when I was really able to open up and start figuring out how can I make my life better, because it just wasn't working.
Right, and it's a story that I think ends up resonating with a lot of us. That's exactly it, and that was this exact same scenario. Like, I talked to Ian, I talked to my girlfriend at the time, and it was like, okay, they're there to listen, but you need to go and talk to somebody that knows what they're doing, and you start to get into that environment, and it changes a lot. But it always kind of goes back to that one conversation, and that can be in a team environment, it can be with somebody that you trust at work, it can be no matter who it is. You have that gut instinct of, okay, your friend stayed back, Casey, for you in that spot. Ian had no choice to drive with me for 6 hours, so it was nothing he could do, but he was still there, and that was a pivotal moment in going to seek out someone that was able to help me further along, and that's the most important. I think we'll do some questions. It's a great question, Alex, because there was an announcement today that Alex Mateas is part of the anti-bullying campaign from the Ottawa. So, what a timely question.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, because it's actually something that I don't have like an answer to, and I don't know what the path is going to be. But as much as we don't have any hazing, that's against the rules, and guys are definitely more welcoming, I'm still surprised at the bullying that still goes on. I talked to the guys about it, and one thing is you do notice a difference in Canada, Canadian players compared to the US, but guys, the jokes and making fun of someone and maybe the chirps will go on for too long, and you'll see over the season that there is a trend that maybe guys will pick on one person more than the others. And as much as I've brought that up before, in my industry, they still say, like, relax, calm down, it's just a joke, it's just a joke. But personally, I don't see it as a joke. If someone was making fun of something about me that I couldn't change, that would get tiring. So as a group, I think the coaches have brought in really good guys, because we do have a good culture and good unit, but it still exists. And I think it's ridiculous for grown men to make fun of other grown men all the time. So it's something that I hope will change in the future.